Good afternoon, and welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. As the public face of humanities for the UC Santa Barbara campus, our mission is to mount programs and support research that advances knowledge about human experience in social, historical, and cultural context. Much of our work takes place in the area of the public humanities through programs designed to empower community members as agents of social change. Those of you present in the room can learn more about the IHC's programs and sign up for our mailing list on the table to my left. Online audience members can do the same by visiting our website. Today's event is sponsored by the IHC's Regeneration Series and the Hester and Cedric Crowell Endowment. We will be taking audience questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Our online audience members can submit questions to our speaker at any time through the question and answer function on your screen, and our in-person audience can line up at the microphone at the front of the center aisle. After her talk, our speaker will be available to sign copies of her books, which are for sale at the back of the room. A recording of this event will be posted to our website in the near future. Finally, before we begin our program, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which UCSB is located, and I would like to pay my respect to Chumash elders, past and present, as well as to other Indigenous people present. Throughout the year, the Regeneration Series has featured speakers who have been considering the social sensibilities and collective actions needed to create a world of greater stability, equity, and solidarity. We are delighted that Vivian Gornick is here to take part in the series, for as we will learn today, rereading is a generative and regenerative experience with the potential to produce new understandings of familiar books and clarifying insights into the self that rereads them. Vivian Gornick was born in the Bronx. She received her BA from City College of New York and completed her MA in literature at NYU. In the 60s, after a brief stint at UC Berkeley, she taught English at the State University of New York at Stony Brook and at Hunter College. From 1969 through 77, she was a reporter for the Village Voice, where she wrote, as she describes it, most often on behalf of radical feminism. And she has said of that period, "Once I found feminism, I found myself." After leaving the Village Voice, over the course of the next 20 years, she taught the memoir and the personal essay in MFA programs all over the country. Out of her teaching experience emerged her book, The Situation and the Story, The Art of Personal Narrative, arguably the best book ever written about the craft of literary nonfiction. Gornick's 1987 memoir, Fierce Attachments, established her as a distinctive voice in the genre of memoir. Fierce Attachments has been translated into 13 languages, and in 2019, the New York Times selected it as the #1 best memoir of the past 50 years. She published another memoir, The Odd Woman in the City, and, exploring the roots of second-wave feminism, wrote a monograph on one of her ideological foremothers called The Solitude of Self, Thinking About Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In 2011, she published Emma Goldman, Revolution as a Way of Life. She has also published 4 essay collections, including The End of the Novel of Love, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and her most recent collection, Taking a Long Look, Essays on Culture, Literature, and Feminism in Our Time, appeared last year. The New York Times described Unfinished Business, Notes of a Chronic Rereader as, quote, lively, personable, and sneakily poignant. To my mind, this is an apt description of both the book and its author. Please join me in welcoming Vivian Gornick to give her talk, The Only True Reader is a Rereader.
Thank you. Okay, so as Susan has told you, this book was called Notes for, I forgot the name of it, Unfinished Business, Notes of a Chronic Rereader. It is a combination of criticism and memoir. So, okay, what I've tried to do here is to show essentially what we all know, that every time you read a book, you're not the same person. You are changed one way or another. You either have more experience or you don't have more experience, but certainly you're older, and you've lived through many things that you did not live through the first time around. Two things happen, I think, when you have this experience. You discover either that the book had to come to you. In other words, the book had to be one that you were ready to receive. On the other hand, you had to go to the book. You had to become more experienced in order to read the book as it deserved to be read. I do consider this, as Susan has said, regeneration in every way. So what I've done here is to try to put together the essence of the book for an hour's talk, and you will see how I intertwine both the reading of the book and my own experience to show how as I change, the book changes, etc. Okay? So mostly this is part of the introduction, and then I took one whole chapter on the writer Elizabeth Bowen. There are 9 chapters in the book. Each one is devoted to another writer. I used this one whole chapter plus a few references to others in order to round out what I hope will be a full picture for you of this book. It has often been my experience that rereading a book that was important to me at earlier times in life is something like lying on the analyst's couch. The narrative I have had by heart for years is suddenly being called into alarming question. It seems that I've misremembered quite a lot about this or that character or this or that plot turn. They met here in New York. I was so sure it was Rome. The time was 1870. I thought it was 1900. And the mother did what to the protagonist? Yet the world still drops away while I'm reading, and I can't help marveling, if I got this wrong and this wrong, how come the book still has me in its grip? Like most readers, I sometimes think I was born reading. I can't remember the time when I didn't have a book in my hand, my head lost to the world around me. On vacation with family or friends, I am quite capable of settling myself, book in hand, on the living room couch in a beautiful country house and hardly stirring out into the glorious green for which we have all come. Once on a train going through the Peruvian Andes, while everyone else was oohing and eyeing out the window, I couldn't lift my eyes from the woman in white. On a Caribbean beach, I sat in the blazing sun, Diane Johnson's Lesser Lives, an imagined biography of George Meredith's first wife, propped on my knees, and was surprised when I looked up to see that I wasn't surrounded by the fog and cold of 1840s England. The companionateness of these books, of all books, nothing can match it. It's the longing for coherence inscribed in the work, that extraordinary attempt at shaping the inchoate through words. It brings peace and excitement, comfort and consolation. But above all, it is the sheer relief from the chaos in the head that reading delivers. Sometimes I think it alone provides me with courage for life, and has from earliest childhood. We lived in an immigrant working-class neighborhood in the Bronx, where all needs were met through the patronage of one of the many stores that ran the length of a single shopping street. The butcher, the baker, the grocer, the bank, the drugstore, the shoe repair, all storefront operations. One day, when I was quite small, 7 or 8, my mother, holding my hand, walked me into a store I'd never before noticed. It was the local branch of the New York Public Library. The room was long, the floorboards bare, and the walls lined floor to ceiling with books. In the middle of the room was planted a desk at which sat Eleanor Roosevelt. In those days, all librarians looked like Eleanor Roosevelt. A tall, bosomy woman with a mass of gray hair piled Belle Epoque style on top of her head, rimless glasses perched high on an incredibly straight nose, and a look of calm interest in her eyes. My mother approached the desk, pointed at my head, and said to Eleanor Roosevelt, "She likes to read." The librarian stood up, said, "Come," and walked me back to the front of the room where the children's books were sectioned. "Start here," she said, and I did. If I'm asked now, and I did. Between then and the time I graduated from high school, I read my way around that room. If I'm asked now to remember what I read in that storefront library, I can only recall that I went from Grimm's fairy tales to Little Women to Of Time and the River. Then I entered college, where I discovered that all these years I've been reading literature. It was at that moment, I think, that I began rereading, because from then on, it was to the books that had become my intimates that I would turn and turn again, not only for the transporting pleasure of the story itself, but to understand what I was living through and what I was to make of it. So in essence, I grew up, I went to City College, I came out, I wandered around, I became a writer, I went to work at the Village Voice, and here I'm cutting into that time for a moment. In late 1970, an editor at The Voice said to me, "There are these women's libbers gathering out on Bleecker Street. Why don't you go out and investigate them?" "What's a women's libber?" I asked. A week later, I was a convert. Within days, I had met Kate Millett, Susan Brown-Miller, Shalomith Firestone, and T. Grace Atkinson, all heroes of the second wave of American feminism. It seemed as though they were all talking at once, and yet I heard every word each of them spoke. Or rather, it was as if I must have heard them all saying the same thing, because I came away from that week branded by a single thought. It was this: the idea that men by nature take their brains seriously and women by nature do not is a belief, not an inborn reality. It serves the culture, and it is central to how all of our lives are shaped. The inability to see oneself primarily as a working person, this I now saw was the central dilemma of a woman's existence. In case you didn't get that, should I repeat? The insight felt new and profound, and above all, compelling. Of a sudden, I saw the unlived lives of women not only as a crime of historic proportion, but a drama of the psyche that came brilliantly to life no sooner was the word sexism applied. And that was the word that now governed my days. Everywhere I looked, I saw sexism. Raw and brutal, ordinary and intimate, ancient and ever-present. I saw it on the street and in the movies, at the bank and in the grocery store. I saw it reading the headlines, riding the subway, having the door held for me. And most shockingly, I saw it in literature. Taking up many of the books I'd grown up with, I saw for the first time that most of the female characters in them were stick figures devoid of flesh and blood, there only to thwart or advance the fortunes of the protagonist, whom I only just then realized was almost always male. It occurred to me that all my reading life, I'd been identifying with characters whose progress through life was at a vital remove from any I would ever make. And at that point, I saw also that I'd always been in conflict about this, but I had never known that I'd been in conflict. Now I saw myself reading differently. I took out the books, novels in particular, I had read and reread and read them again. This time around, I saw that whatever the story, whatever the style, whatever the period, the central drama in literary work was nearly always dependent on the perniciousness of the human self-divide I now felt operating in myself. The fear and ignorance it generates, the shame it gives rise to, the debilitating mystery in which it enshrouds us. I also saw that invariably what made the work of a good book affecting, and this was something implicit in the writing, trapped somewhere in the nerves of the prose, was some haunted imagining of human existence with the rift healed, the parts brought together, the hunger for connection put in brilliant working order. Great literature, I thought then and think now, is a record of the achievement, not of the achievement of wholeness of being, but of the ingrained effort made on its behalf. I was 20 years old the day an English teacher put into my hands Sons and Lovers. Until then, I'd never even heard the term coming-of-age novel, but I knew one when I saw one, and D.H. Lawrence put the matter so starkly and so dramatically that even at that tender age, I felt myself communing with the primitive conflict at the heart of the tale. I read the book in one gulp, came back to class entranced, and from that day forward, Sons and Lovers was biblical text. I read the novel 3 times within the next 15 years, and each time identified with another of its major characters. The hero, Paul Morell, his mother, Gertrude, his youthful lovers, Miriam and Clara. The first time around, it was Miriam, the farmer's daughter with whom Paul loses his virginity. I got her immediately. She sleeps with him not because she wants to, but because she fears losing him. During intercourse, her terror is such that instead of yielding to the experience, she lies beneath Paul, who's lost to his own sexual delirium, thinking, does he know it's me? Does he know it's me? Miriam's primary need is to know that she is desired and for herself alone. The dilemma was devastating. I felt the heat, the fear, the anxiety engulfing each of these two, but most especially I felt it as though I was Miriam herself. I was 20 years old. I needed what she needed. The next time I read the book, I was Clara, the working class woman who is sexually passionate, wants to engage with erotic life, but still is alive to the potential for humiliation, hidden in her need to feel that it is she who is being desired, and again for herself alone. The 3rd time I read the book, I was in my mid-30s, twice married, twice divorced, newly liberated. And I identified with Paul himself. Now preoccupied with desiring rather than being desired, I gloried in giving myself up to the shocking pleasure of sexual experience itself, rich, full, transporting. Imagining myself now like Paul at the end of the novel, the hero of my own life. When I came to reread Sons and Lovers again recently, in, shall we say, my advanced maturity, it wasn't so much that I found I'd gotten many of the details wrong, which I had, but rather that my memory of the overriding theme, sexual passion as the central experience of a life, was wrong. This, I now saw, was not really what the book was about, and I found it all the greater and the more moving that I had held it close to my heart all these years for a set of not misinformed, but insufficiently informed reasons. It was also one of the first times that I saw clearly that it was I, as a reader, who had had to journey toward the richest meaning of the book. Lawrence was writing at the beginning of the Freudian century, the time when Western culture was on the verge of validating his own inner torment. His metaphor, the repression of the erotic, was in fact to become the wedge that modernism used to pry open the uncharted territory of human consciousness. If Lawrence were alive today, this metaphor would not be available to him, because today all have had long experience of the sexual freedom once denied, and have discovered firsthand that the making of a self from the inside out is not to be achieved through the senses alone. Not only does sexual ecstasy not deliver us to ourselves, one must have a self already in place to know what to do with it should it come. Between what we know and what we cannot hope to know about how we come to be as we are, lies an emotional dumping ground into which exceptional writers pour all the art they are capable of making. Marguerite Duras, whom I had written about previously in this book, was one of these writers. Another was Elizabeth Bowen, whose power I felt when I was young, but whose value I did not grasp until I was old. Quite early, I gulped down 3 of her major books, The Death of the Heart, The House in Paris, The Heat of the Day, and then never looked at another word she wrote. I thrilled to the sense of mystery inscribed in Bowen's inordinately original sentences, and to the feeling that something profound was being alluded to in them. But what exactly it was, if my life had depended upon it, I could not have described. I remember following the sentences, often with a finger on the page, like a child or a non-English speaker, as though struggling to pick out meaning from an unknowable language. The thing about her sentences is that almost all of them are involuted, and so they read exactly like in a foreign language until you understand what it is that she is slowing you down for. That is the purpose of the sentences, of the sentence structure. What I could not see in those far-off years was that Bowen was slowing the narrative down with her involuted syntax so that the reader would come under her spell while she labored to get on paper an emotional experience for which there were perhaps no words, or never the right words, or words she couldn't put in the right order, but one that nonetheless haunted her writing. Then one day, not too long ago, I came across something the American poet Adrienne Rich had written about Emily Dickinson that struck me forcibly, and suddenly there, front and center in my mind, was Elizabeth Bowen. What Rich had written about Dickinson was this, quote, I learned from her that there were extreme psychological states that can be hunted down with language, but that language had to be forged, found, made. It was not in the first words that came to mind. I went to my bookshelves, picked up a Bowen novel, and started reading. On the instant, the text seemed to decode itself, its mission, if not its meaning, coming clear. Within months, I was able to see that for 30 years and more, she had created stories and novels meant to acquaint the reader with the power of the one thing, the extreme psychological state that she deeply understood, namely that fear of feeling makes us inflict on one another the little murders of the soul that anesthetize the spirit and shrivel the heart, that stifle desire and humiliate sentiment, that make war electrifying and peace dreary. One other thing I saw, she was one of those novelists whose work, taken as a whole, was a naked demonstration of the psychological damage that often provides the nerve current running steadily beneath the surface of a writer's prose. She was born in 1899 in Ireland into Anglo-Irish aristocracy and grew up in a cold, drafty manor house set down in a rainy, fog-bound land among people locked into a rigid sense of the responsibilities of privilege and tradition. Many of these people were brooding, strong-willed, emotionally intemperate, yet they feared impropriety more than death itself. As is said of a character in Bowen's early novel, The Last September, quote, life was to him an affair of discomfort, but that discomfort should be made articulate seemed to him shocking. From the start, she had all the metaphors she needed. When Elizabeth was 5 years old, her father had a mental breakdown from which he never really recovered. When she was 13, her mother died of cancer. After that, she lived among relatives and in boarding houses and boarding schools, feeling obscurely humiliated, even as her biographer Victoria Glendenning puts it, disfigured by her orphan state. Children can feel that. It was then that she came to experience the relief as well as the isolation of guarded feelings. Years later, Bowen identified this period of her life as, quote, the beginning of a career of withstood emotion. From here on in, she, like most of her characters, would become an intimate of what she called life with the lid on. The novel that is almost encyclopedic in presenting a full range of characters to flesh out the consequences of life with a lid on is The Death of the Heart, published in 1938. Mr. and Mrs. Quain and their son Thomas are leading a proper suburban existence when suddenly in his late 50s, Mr. Quain kicks over the traces and has an affair with Irene, a young woman working in a London flower shop. When Irene becomes pregnant, Mrs. Quain cheerfully expels him from the family home, not because her heart is broken, but because Mr. Quain's situation is morally, that is socially, unacceptable to her. So Mr. Quain, Irene, and Portia, their love child, then, as in a 19th century novel, exile themselves to the continent and spend the next 15 years wandering around Europe. Both parents die, and the 16-year-old Portia is sent to live for a year in the Regent's Park home of Thomas, her businessman half-brother. However, neither Thomas nor his wife Anna is familiar with any degree of normal emotional expressiveness. In fact, the mere idea of such expressiveness makes each of them ill, and the home they have made for themselves is steeped in a silent propriety that serves them as social beings while masking a multitude of hungers and disappointments neither would know what to do with if brought out into the open. Soon enough, Portia becomes desperate to figure out why in this house there are, quote, no limits to the loneliness she could feel, even when she was feeling quite resigned. The catalyst, however, for her ultimate mortification is Eddie, an old college friend of Anna's brother. Eddie had once been a brilliant, beautiful scholarship boy, longing to make his way among the rich and the well-born of Oxford, many of whom had initially found him amusing and then abruptly dropped him. His sense of insult is profound, but instead of walking away from the source of the offense, he clings to whatever remnant of social connection remains available to him. Glued to the edge of a world that will never welcome him as an equal, he gradually becomes less and less real to himself, while everyone else, of course, becomes even more unreal. Soon enough, Eddie is as emotionally detached as Adam probably was 10 minutes after he'd eaten the apple. Detachment makes Eddie unreliable, but it is the emptiness within that makes him dangerous. When he meets Portia at the house in Regent's Park, he courts her by persuading her that they are twins, similarly adrift in the brutish world of the unresponsive bourgeoisie. She, pathetically grateful for his attention, assumes a bond of love has been formed between them, and for a while, Eddie pursues the relationship because her naivete allows him to, quote, look right through her without being made shamefully conscious of the vacuum there must be in his own eyes. In time, of course, betrayal is a foregone conclusion. Yet the appeal of Eddie is central to the strength of the book. Although ostensibly an adult, he's actually a true Bowen child, of whom there are many. As with Portia in The Death of the Heart, there is Lois in The Last September, Davina in The Disinherited, Leopold in The House in Paris. And in Eddie's presence, we are face to face with the human fallout at the center of each of Bowen's novels. In him, we feel a frightening innocence, the innocence of stunned empathy, lying just beneath the damage that has been done to each of the children and that each in turn is destined to inflict on those who love them. My own Eddie was a man I met at the age of 18, when I could easily have doubled for Bowen's Portia, and to whom I remained enthralled for decades. Daniel, I'll call him, 10 years older than I, was darkly handsome, extraordinarily bright, and possessed of a soft, soulful kind of courtesy that never failed to make me feel loved. But the real strength of the attraction between us was rooted in shared sensibility. In this regard, Daniel and I were brilliantly matched. Ours was a communion of mind and spirit that Wordsworth might have admired. The conversation between us was its own work of art. We walked together by the hour, discoursing ardently on life, love, literature, each of us yearning, as in a Russian play, toward the remarkable intensity produced by the words that passed between us. This intensity brought peace, joy, excitement, in bed, on the street, at the breakfast table. A depth of well-being I didn't know was missing from my life until suddenly it was there in Daniel's presence. Yet it was also true that from our earliest time together, he sent such mixed signals about who and what he was that often in the years following our breakup, I would wonder who that benighted girl, me, had been who had indulged in such willed blindness. When we met, he told me 3 things about himself. 1, he had been married and was now divorced. 2, his parents were living in Europe. 3, he was an ex-alcoholic. I soon discovered that he had been married twice, not once. His parents were living in Kansas City, not abroad. And on occasion, he'd astonish me by downing a drink. Also, he often didn't call or come when he said he would, or he'd arrive 2, sometimes 3 hours late with some disheveled account of his whereabouts, his eyes shining with delight at now, at long last, being in my company. We've all known this, right? Within minutes, he had led us away from his delinquency into some newly absorbing conversation in which I clearly was an invaluable participant. How he glowed when he spoke, and I responded poetically to what he said. My beautiful, marvelous girl, he would invariably beam. You are life itself. And as I was besotted, I routinely chose to ignore that about Daniel, which was transparently alarming. But perhaps chose is the wrong word. In 1923, Elizabeth Bowen married Alan Cameron, an education administrator, for whom she felt friendship, not passion, and with whom she maintained a civilized connection until his death 30 years later. In the interim, she had affairs, many affairs. Sensation, she once said, I have never fought shy of or done anything to restrain. In 1941, however, in London, in the middle of the Blitz, she met Charles Ritchie, a 35-year-old second secretary at the Canadian High Commission, and with him she fell deeply and irrevocably in love. For Bowen, the affair was life-changing. For the unmarried, womanizing Ritchie, it was only one among many that he habitually, even troublingly, conducted. 10 months after he and Bowen had met, Ritchie was writing in his diary, Elizabeth is sad because she loves me more than I love her. It is sad for me too, in another way. Charles Ritchie was Bowen's Eddie come to life. He was not only smoothly intelligent and well-educated, he was charm itself, and could talk to anyone, anywhere, and make them feel they were persons of interest and value. In fact, almost nothing and no one could hold either his attention or his affection for very long. Although Ritchie would never have dreamt of breaking openly with the conventions of his class, in the presence of those conventions, he was made dangerously restless. In 1939, at the age of 33, he was already confiding to his diary, family life makes me long for the brothel or the anchorite cell. There resided within him a vast emptiness, which he, too, medicated with sensation. He was attractive to women, and sleeping with them was his drug of choice. From the start, he was routinely unfaithful to Bowen. Nevertheless, their arrangement prevailed until death did them part. Ostensibly, the affair lasted because Bowen persisted in seeing Ritchie in an heroic light, and he, in turn, fell in love with her view of him. But the real dynamic at the heart of their lifelong attachment was that each had recognized something crucial about themselves in the other, the disfiguring power of withstood emotion, and longed for rescue from its arid fate. This longing, unevenly shared as it was, sealed a bond between Bowen and Ritchie that was made dramatic by the extraordinary combination of need, cynicism, and self-deception upon which the whole affair fed. In a book called Love's Civil War, published in 2008 by Victoria Glendenning, we have a selection of Bowen's letters to Ritchie and those diary entries of his written around the same time that she was writing these letters. Together they reveal a 15-year period of her writing passionate letters, actually the same passionate letter, over and over again, while he, at the same time, is confiding to his diary his bottomless dismay over his own spiritual dissoluteness. I choose a few selections randomly from the years 1945 to 1955 to demonstrate the astonishing disparity at any given moment between what he was thinking and feeling, while she was fantasizing and effusing. So with Richie, it's all his diary entries, and with her, it's all the letters. So Richie, he writes, I don't think of E as much as I did. I don't even think about myself. How long can I stand the neatness and emptiness of my life? Bowen, dearest, I think of you so much and love you so much. This past year has been rather like a year on the screen, 1 week differentiated from another only by your letters. Richie, nothing gloomier than this Christmas has ever happened to me. I suppose someday this death of the heart, this paralysis of the mind, this dreary vacuum will end. The trouble is that when I begin to ask myself the question, what woman do I love? I am overcome by a sort of mental dizziness. I feel capable of loving any woman up to a point and in one way or another. Bowen, my darling, our love is like something that we have given birth to. It has an independent existence of its own, outside temporary anguish and loneliness. It is like an angel, able to comfort us and bless us. Richie, coming round the corner to go up to my office, I thought what I would like would be to find myself in a big double bed with a woman, with the curtains drawn and pink-shaded lights, and to fuck and smoke a cigarette and talk a little and drink some champagne and then do it all over again. Bowen, I am torn and demented by my longing for you. Oh, my darling, what a year for us to have had. We are always near to each other, close to each other, all the week round, every week, but naturally this sense of each other floods in most at the weekends, doesn't it? Richie, with me, love for a woman is always linked with a need to betray that love, a compulsion which I dread and desire. Bowen, there are times when I begin to feel almost ill with longing for you, and life becomes an almost unbearable strain. I won't say anything. It wasn't long before I realized that Daniel was a pathological liar. If he went out for a newspaper, he said he was going for cigarettes. If he said he was working late, he was probably at a movie. If having dinner with one friend more often than not, it was with another. It was as though it was important that no one knew where or what he was doing at any given moment. The lying went hand in hand with an equally pathological unreliability. Waiting for him in a public place, store, restaurant, library, was almost certainly a prescription for disaster. I was so unaccustomed to such behavior that at first I was only startled, and the first few times merely demurred. Then I remonstrated, then I grew exasperated, then I fell into a rage. Don't you see how insulting this is, I would cry, how discounted you make me feel. Sometimes I wept or screamed or withdrew. Nothing I did reached him. Invariably, he would stare at me or hang his head or murmur feeble words of apology, but always he looked puzzled. He genuinely could not fathom why I was taking on so. One evening at a party given by some acquaintances of mine, I came out of the bathroom in a somewhat darkened part of the apartment where the party was taking place to find Daniel and the hostess in a clinch. I must have cried out because they broke apart and the woman fled. I still remember my heart pounding in my chest and my head feeling like it was about to explode. Are you sleeping with her? I asked. No, he said. Are you thinking of sleeping with her? Not especially. I was just curious. What are you getting so excited about? What am I getting so excited about? The thing I remember most from that incident was how devoid of all affect Daniel's entire demeanor, face, voice, body remained throughout this exchange. For the first time, it occurred to me that emotionally he was somewhere on another planet. That night, Daniel confided quite casually that he envied me the strength of my feelings. When I asked him what he meant by that, he said that from the time he could remember, he himself seemed to have nothing that resembled an ordinary complement of emotions. Whatever it is that people feel when they're happy, sad, confused, he said, I don't feel it, I never have. It's as though there's a leak somewhere in me, and it all got drained out. But I said, when I tell a joke, you laugh. When that girl in the wheelchair came into the restaurant, you rushed to help her find a seat. When we make love, you're passionate. His smile was rueful. That's just me passing for normal. I've studied people for years to see how they act in various situations, and I've taught myself to imitate them. I've slept with women who've told me I'm a good lover. You've told me I'm a good lover. But as we all know, the body responds even when the brain doesn't. No sooner do I achieve orgasm than I'm wishing myself gone, because then I must demonstrate the tenderness I never feel. Yes, even with you, in the end, they all leave me, as you will leave me. And you know, when you do, I won't even feel lonely. I'll just feel weary to death. You know that word, inanition? It's got my name on it. Suddenly, my young heart was flooded with luxuriant pity. I saw him then as a stricken creature, stigmatized by some heroic woundedness, a sacrifice even to existential damage, poetic in his affliction, even bearing somehow, and here's where the appeal grew dangerous, some mythic burden of redemption for the rest of us. I vowed silently never to desert him. Over the years, Daniel betrayed and deceived and defrauded me countless times with open infidelities, public embarrassments, ruined vacations, even embezzled bank accounts. Yet repeatedly I was seduced anew. The combined power of his life-giving conversation coupled with a pitiable vacancy at his center, holding me fast. What I failed to register throughout those years was that I had become addicted to a peculiar sense of well-being that came only when Daniel and I were in harmony and deserted me when we were estranged. It was as though knowing him had brought into consciousness some primitive set of hungers that I could neither identify nor hope to satisfy on my own. At those times, I felt a kind of drift within myself I had never before experienced. If I had but realized it, I was enthralled to some romantic ideal of trust between us, the one he routinely betrayed, that provided all the excuse I needed to persist in the delusion that I was grounding myself, all the while I remained in free fall. Bowen had actually been writing Charles Ritchie, alias Daniel, alias Eddie, into her characters long before she met him, and nowhere more so than in Max, a protagonist in The House in Paris, published in 1935 and one of her more tragic explorations of life with the lid on. The house belongs to Madame Fisher and her daughter Naomi. To make ends meet, the two women take in upper-class English or American girls spending a season in Paris. 15 years before the book opens, sometime in the 1920s, the English Karen Michaelis, aged 18, is one of these girls. She and Naomi become fast friends and talk endlessly about Max, a darkly unapproachable young man of French, English, Jewish extraction who works in a bank and comes to the house to visit Madame Fisher. 5 years later, after things that are happening in the novel, Karen goes back to England, doesn't see Max or Madame Fisher or Naomi for a long time. 5 years later, Max and Naomi show up in London, now engaged to be married. Karen, too, is engaged to be married to Ray, an Englishman of her own class. Neither Max nor Karen feel passion for the people they are to marry, and on this visit they realize that they are, and always have been, painfully attracted to one another. A few weeks later, they meet in secret, spend a night of love together, agonize over their star-crossed situation, and part. Returning to Paris, Max breaks his engagement to Naomi, is taunted by Madame Fisher, a horrifying self-hatred overcomes him, and he commits suicide. Karen, meanwhile, is left pregnant, has a nervous breakdown, gives the baby up for adoption, and marries Ray. In Bowen's talented hands, this melodramatic tale becomes a metaphor for all in life that can hardly be expressed, much less realized. As it is Max, not Karen, whom life has already twisted out of shape, it is he who bears the burden of articulating the hopelessness within which they are caught. He begins by describing how he came to be engaged to Naomi. A born outsider, not for nothing that drop of Jewishness, Max has been adrift within himself all his life, a man in his own eyes, a bad lot. On the one hand, cautious, on the other, sly, despairing of life on the margin, tormented by inappropriate desires, never for a moment able to make peace with himself. Of all the characters in Bowen's work to whom I have resonated, it is Max, above all, who makes me feel I stand at the edge of the abyss. Max, through whom the primitive fear of consciousness itself comes most alive, the fear rooted in the suspicion that should we get to the heart of things, we will find nothing. One night a few years ago, Daniel suddenly turned up on my doorstep, wanting to know why I had let him hang around for so long. Ever figure out what was in it for you? He asked. I sat down in a chair I'd been sitting in for years, and in a voice made husky by the prospect of revelation, said to the analyst sitting opposite me, "It is only now, for the first time, that I really see, how devious I've been about my relationships with men." The analyst let herself look weary before she replied, "Do you know how many times you have said, 'Now for the first time I see'? When are you going to act on what you now for the first time see?" I stared at her, she stared at me. What a fate, I thought that day, for the New York analyst, condemned to years of listening to analysts like myself, insight manufacturers, one and all, who are forever seeing something or other for the first time, and none of us able to act on what we see. At that moment, some juvenile bit of rebelliousness exploded in me. "Fuck it," I cried to myself. "Let me out of here. Let me out of this chair, out of this room, out of this life. I can't do it. I simply cannot do it." Sometime later, I was rereading Jude the Obscure, and coming up against Sue Bridehead's miserably inadequate explanation for her own god-awful behavior, recalled this scene in the analyst's office. I thought then, she can't do it either. She too just wants out, and couldn't decide whether to extend poor Sue my compassion or my contempt. I still can't. Throughout my late teens and 20s, I ached for the characters in Thomas Hardy's novels, men and women doomed to endure long years of suffering that end in the most appalling defeat, only because they've been born into the wrong class in the wrong place at the wrong time. Among these characters, none wrung me out as much as Sue Bridehead, a woman whose story retained mythic power throughout many phases of my own experience. As I watched her struggle, so I thought, to achieve something that resembled an integrated life against the odds that it pleased me for the longest time to identify with. When I reread the book recently, I must say that while I still felt as though a stone was pressing down on my chest as I followed the monumental misfortune of both Jude and Sue, what interested me most was seeing how brilliantly a great Victorian novelist had tracked the resistance to consciousness that afflicts us all through the movements of a character endowed with so much flesh and blood reality that she seems very nearly a case study. The action in Jude unfolds late in the 19th century between a set of villages in rural England and the fictional university town of Christminster. Jude Foley, a born reader, growing up poor and ignorant in the countryside, longs for a life of learning in far-off Christminster. This longing not only sustains him, it colors his entire waking life. It is the dream upon which his expectations of a realized existence are based. The very fact that Jude has such expectations sets him apart from the people among whom he's growing. Enter Sue Bridehead, Jude's cousin, an odd young woman possessed of an unusually free-thinking mind, who quickly becomes his friend and his mentor, warning him from the start against idealizing Christminster. It's an ignorant place, she insists, except as to the townspeople. Artisans, drunkards, paupers, they see life as it is, but few of the people in the colleges do. You prove it in your own person. You are one of the very men Christminster was intended for when the colleges were founded, a man with a passion for learning, but no money, or opportunities, or friends. But you were elbowed off the pavement by the millionaire's sons. By her own lights, Sue is something of a psychological enigma. My life, she explains to Jude, has been entirely shaped by what people call a peculiarity in me, meaning she is profoundly asexual, a woman with a libido that from earliest childhood has been preparing to go underground. Like a tomboy who remains a tomboy, she has always felt companionate with men, but never desirous of them. Having sensed early the danger inherent in erotic connection, she has never been able to free herself of the fear that such connection would mean slavery for her. The marriage ceremony alone, with its demand that she obey as well as love and honor, throws her into a state of terror. This peculiarity in Sue, as she herself puts it, has been the bane of her existence. Many men have been drawn to what looks like her ethereal purity, all of them certain that hers is a virginal fear that will evaporate once intimacy is achieved, only to come up against the brick wall of a frozen resistance that will weaken as her love for Jude grows, but will never dissolve out. Throughout her troubled life, Sue will be pulled around by the agitation that the prospect of sexual love sets up in her, bringing misery to everyone who gets involved with her, as she, herself without a clue as to why the dread never lets up, wrings her hands and stamps her feet and cries, "I can't, I can't." There's a haunting moment in the novel when Sue is trying to explain to the man whom she, in all innocence, marries, why she can't sleep with him. But of course she can't explain. What is there to explain? You repel me? And at last, in an anguish as confusing to her as it is to him, she cries out, "Why should I suffer for what I was born to be if it doesn't hurt other people?" In answer to which the husband cries out, "But it does. It hurts me." She stares speechless at him. She really does not know what he is talking about. Only slowly over the years, reading and rereading this passage, did I come to realize that the failure of emotional imagination in the novel belongs entirely to her. It is because she cannot see herself as others see her that she cannot fathom the unhappiness she inflicts on all who love her. It dawned on me then that she cannot see herself because she does not know herself, does not want to know herself. It is herself with whom she cannot live, herself from whom she is in constant repelled flight. Racing down a clear track of memory, I thought, what a long road this novel and I have traveled together, and with so many stops along the way. When I first encountered Sue's devotion to erotic abstinence, I found it thrilling. Her holding herself apart from sexual love because the integrity of her very being seems to depend on it, touched a chord, I was again in my 20s, touched a chord of response in me that in my 20s felt prescient, as though something elemental was just now coming into focus. It was the double bind of sexual love, especially for a young person. It's attraction, repulsion. Rarely, if ever, had I seen it addressed in the novels I've been reading, and never as a key development in a major female character. I felt myself intensely sympathetic to Sue's plight. At the heart of her remarkable behavior lay the mysterious, exciting possibility of an all-in-allness that might be achieved through oneself alone. 10 years later, courageous abstinence had lost its glamour, and Sue was getting on my nerves. Now she just seemed sexually frigid, and I was horrified by her mad regression into religiosity, which happens. At the time, I was teaching the novel in an adult education course, and when a smart-ass student called out, for Christ's sake, does she have to go crazy? Can't she get a job? I felt myself in sync with the Philistine's exasperation. Why, indeed, was Hardy never holding her to account for the lunatic behavior I now found repellent? A decade later, when I was again met up with Sue, my feelings had undergone yet another sea change. I had just had an illegal abortion, and to my dismay was experiencing a sense of foreboding I myself found shocking. Somewhere deep inside, in a place I could not put a name to, I, secular to the bone, was experiencing something like fear of retribution. One day during this time, while out walking, the words formed themselves in my head, "For this you will be punished." I went upstairs and, as though sleepwalking, took Jude off the bookshelf and turned to the section on Sue's disintegration into religious mania. Now I read them, sort of marveling, and I shuddered as I read, thinking of the wealth of superstitious dread that must be lurking just below reasoning mindfulness in even the most unlikely of people. For the first time I felt, I understood. What was it that I, yet again, was understanding for the first time? It was the darkness at the heart of Sue's passivity. What Hardy had made radiate in her was the ancient fear of taking in one's own experience. What I was now understanding for the first time was how deeply that fear revels in its own unknowingness, how mocking it is its resistance. When I read Jude again, most recently, I wondered as I turned the last page if the book had finally finished saying what it had to say to me. The other day, I was asked a question of fact that I could not answer about a book I had once known well but hadn't looked at in years. Naturally, I thought if I just riffed through it, I'd soon have the information that now eluded me. As it happened, the copy of this book that had been sitting on my bookshelf untouched for decades was a cheap 1970s paperback that began to fall apart in my hands no sooner had I picked it up. I turned back the cover, and the first page came instantly away from the spine of the book. Then page after page came loose, and bits of paper from their crumbling edges began to rain down. Soon I was looking at more than 400 loose pages lying all about, on my lap, on the desk, on the floor. Somehow, this devastation of the book went through me like an electric shock. It was as though the physical book had been a living thing, and I could not bear to sweep its tortured remains into the trash. I began picking up random pages, holding one after another up close to my eyes, as if committing to new memory its fading print, and then up to my nose, as if intent on inhaling some essence of book. After that, I alternated between concentrating on individual pages and examining the dried-out glue along the spine, as if it held some scientific secret that would explain what had happened. Suddenly, my attention was caught by the sight of a sentence I must have underlined some 40 years ago, and after that, a paragraph I'd encircled, and in a margin, 2 exclamation points standing side by side. I looked first at the underlined sentence. It puzzled me. Why'd you underline this? I asked myself. What's so interesting here? Then again, look at this one you've just underlined. What were you thinking? My eyes drifted to a sentence on the page opposite where nothing was underlined, and I thought, now here's something really interesting. How come this didn't attract your attention all those years ago? How come indeed? I began to read the various pages with readers' marks on them, and then I began to piece them together, like an archaeologist poring over ancient fragments to see which order will yield some design worth having been excavated. And soon enough, I saw my younger reading self clear enough, marveling at the most elementary insights this wonderful book had yielded up. Very nearly, it was as though I'd written "so true" all over the margins. I put the pages back together in their proper order and sat down to read the book anew, this time underlining and encircling in a pen of another color the sentences and passages that now struck me as worth noting. Then I bound the pages together with a thick rubber band and put the book back on the shelf where it had been sitting all this time. I hope I live long enough to read it again with a pen of yet another color in hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an incredible talk, and your words are so inspiring, and I think resonate with all of us as our chuckles attest to. Oh, should I speak a little louder?
A little louder.
Okay, my question is, do you have someone specific that you imagine when you're writing as your audience? Or to rephrase that, who is your audience?
My friends. I write for myself and my friends. I write to people I think I'm going to say something that's half familiar to them and half new, as it will be to me. Anyway, that's who I write for.
Mix of the familiar and the kind of innovative and thought-provoking. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Easy question.
Good afternoon. You're a great rereader of Lawrence.
Yes, thank you.
But there are a lot of rereaders who tend to reject him in adulthood. They see him as part of their adolescence or something like that. I wonder why you think that is. And also, of most of the people you've read, the one person that I recall that you tended to place in sort of youth was Colette. I wonder why
Yeah.
you feel like you outgrew her.
Say that again?
Do you feel like you outgrew Colette?
Well, yeah, I do, definitely. Yes, the piece in the book that this man is referring to is a piece on Colette, which was actually one of the first rereadings I ever did that startled me because I had loved Colette as a young woman in my early 20s, as every young woman of our kind, you know, very literary young women at City College in New York, loved Colette. We thought she was showing us ourselves as we were to become. She was the great teacher, and in fact, what she was teaching us was that a great passion is worth everything, right? The world is well lost for a great passion. That's what Colette was all about: sexual passion, erotic passion. No matter what, it could be hell. Your life could be destroyed. You could become miserable for the rest of your life. It didn't matter. What mattered was what you would learn about yourself through a great passion. Well, when I was 21, 2, 3, lots of young women, we all read this, and we felt it was our book of wisdom. We felt she was giving us life. The way she was talking about a woman in love, the way men wrote about war and peace, God and man. And it felt that way. It felt like she was revealing the human condition. Well, I don't think any young woman today can read Colette as we read her then. No one in their early 20s can possibly read this great writer. She does not wear well. I mean, it felt absurd to reread all this stuff and see how clearly, how embarrassingly aged these ideas were, these feelings. So I wrote this long chapter to make you see what I saw.
Why do you think people feel like they outgrow the age you were?
Actually, that's not true. Lawrence is enjoying a resurgence of interest. There are a number of new biographies written of him, and people are seeing him anew. And in England, Lawrence has never lost favor. There's always been somebody writing as though discovering him for the first time. But he is hard to take. I'm not up for rediscovering him. I've tried. I can't read him anymore. I can't. No, I can't. The rhetoric is too thick. The passions are too intense. I can't. Nevertheless, I recognize not only that he is a great writer, but his influence on me, and how important he once was. And I have enjoyed rereading Sons and Lovers more than anything else of Lawrence. I still think it's really pretty close to the best of all the books.
All right, so you have an abortion. There's some dark stirring in you. The sentence titrates up, "For this you will pay," and you go to your bookshelf and you pick up Hardy. So my question is, at that moment, or more generally, are you reading a novel to discover the meaning of your experience, or does your experience bring you to new insights about literature? Or
Well,
can you disambiguate?
I think in that case of that particular instance that I went through, I was trying to show that it's a circle. Yeah, or that looping thing, you know, I don't know what you call it. It's a configuration, huh? The Mobius circle, something like that. Yeah, that's what it actually felt like. I felt and I thought that I tried to describe that.
So you
Yes.
kind of come into clarity together, the book and your life at that moment.
It was a moment when I felt melodramatic myself, and suddenly melodrama seemed to have some value. And then I realized that's what Thomas Hardy is incarnate. melodrama that has intense value if you know how to read them.
So the best thing that can happen to a reader
Is to have an
not-
abortion and
is to not really register most of what a book's about, so it can live inside of her until at the right moment the meaning can emerge.
I think there's something to that.
So much of what we read in order not to be able to
Right.
metabolize
Yeah.
the time. We take
But I
in
think
more than
every rereader will say what you've just said, that the book lives inside one long enough, if it does, so that you can go back and reapply through new experience and see what you couldn't see before. And I mean, I never felt a moment of interest or sympathy for any of Sue Bridehead's religious mania. And of course I still don't. But when you go back and see what he invested in it, and I could only see it after that thrilling, terrible, retribution will be yours, which was young. And anyway, I felt like I never read it before. Like I never understood the depth of mystery that he was getting at through all this melodrama. Yeah, definitely.
Any other questions? All right, well, I
Okay.
think we're going to say thank you so much.
Thank
and,
you.
It's been a pleasure, and
Good.
thank you to our audience for being there.
Yes, thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.